Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchak, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Dershowitz, it's so great to see you again.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. The French presidential election has been on everybody's minds, especially in regards to the impact it will have on French-Israeli relations. Joining us now is former Israeli Knesset member Daniel Ben-Simon, who was actually born in Morocco and immigrated to Israel as a teenager in 1969. Aside from being a leading journalist and prize-winning author, Ben-Simon is also an expert on France, French-Israeli relations, and the French-Israeli community. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Ben-Simon.
Thank you very much.
All right, so let's start with your take on the French presidential elections and the impact on the French Jewish community. I know that Professor Dershowitz is eager to discuss this with you.
Listen, the results were okay, were good for France, but it's the end result is bad because it's a fragmented society. Nearly 45% of the French are either the extreme left or extreme right. The center is collapsing. So the old parties have vanished in the last elections. And so the good guy won the first round. But will he be able to run France after the elections if he wins? So the question is about the French society. Looks bad today, very, very fractured and fragmented.
Well, I think this tells you something about the whole world, not only France. France
welcome, thank you.
Tip of the iceberg in some ways. Look at what's going on in England, where the Labour Party has been taken over by an extreme leftist. Thankfully, centrism still holds with Prime Minister May. In the United States, the left is moving far, far, far to the left. Sanders, the most popular Democratic politician in the United States today. The right is moving further to the right with the alt-right. All over Eastern Europe, we see extremism growing, and the center is weakening tremendously all over the world. And what we see in France and what we see all over the world is the right and the left, the extremes, have so much more in common. Today's New York Times has a story that a lot of the Trotskyist voters who voted for the extreme left candidate are now going to vote for Le Pen because Stalinism and Hitlerism had a great deal in common. And the extreme right and the extreme left have a great deal in common. They both don't tolerate free speech. They both tend to have antagonism toward Jewish values and to the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think they are intolerant in general for different points of view. So we see a worldwide phenomenon that hasn't been made any easier by the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States.
Absolutely. And let's say a word about Marine Le Pen. I don't know if you know her, if you met her. But she started from nothing. She killed her father politically, kind of pesticide of the old days in Greece, and she became now the champion of the far right. She's going to have 2 weeks from now, if she loses, she still will stay with 40 to 44% of the French society, which is quite amazing. I mean, anti-Semitic and racist, and whatever you say. I mean, she wants France to the French only, and this is a symptom of a society which is not heading to the right as a good way.
Now, what will this mean for French-Israeli relations if Marine Le Pen is in fact to win?
Well, I don't think she will win, but if she wins, she has no problem today with the Jewish immigrants or the second generation or third generation Jews in France, but mostly Islam, radical Islam and Muslims. You have about 6 million Muslims in France. If she wins, I'm afraid we might have a kind of a small revolution.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
I've heard that there are some efforts by Le Pen and some of her supporters to try to recruit support from among French Jews, particularly Sephardic Jews, who have to have direct encounters, often violent encounters, with Muslim immigrants. It would be a terrible thing, in my view, for any Jew to be supportive of a kind of neo-fascist regime like Le Pen. but I understand the temptation. Are there going to be any significant number of Jews who do you think will be fooled into voting for Le Pen?
You know, they tell me, I used to have a radio program in France, and people would call and they would tell me, Mr. Ben-Simon, she will fight our enemies. That's the most important thing. We live in Marseille. Marseille has 50% of the population is Muslim. And you have something like 90,000 Jews living in Marseille, and they meet the Muslims on a daily, on an hourly basis. They say she will protect us. When she wins, if she wins, they will be so scared by her, and she will, run all kind of policies that they will be afraid. So in a way, they might vote for her secretly. They don't say this openly. They are not in the polls, and that's why she's going to get big support. But mainly, she will stop the Muslims. That it's not economics, it's not society, it's rather the Islam, if you want, threat. She will be better than the others to stop it.
Doesn't that sound familiar after having watched the American election? Many voted for Trump on the ground that he will stop immigration, stop Mexican, quote, rapists and drug dealers. There's no evidence that that's true at all. And stop Muslims, the, quote, Muslim ban, which he denies is a Muslim ban and which will probably be upheld by the courts. But nonetheless, that appealed to a lot of xenophobic people in America who thought he would be a great protection against Islam. But we're seeing that again happening in Hungary. We're seeing it happening in Greece. We're seeing it happening in Poland. We're seeing it happening in Germany. Hopefully in Germany it won't in the end succeed, but certainly the phenomenon has been an amazing one. And when you think of the harm that America caused by starting the Iraq War many years ago now, which really was the beginning of the disintegration of the Middle East in many ways, and certainly contributed to the massive immigration into Europe. Who could have predicted at that point in time the impact of that unwise decision on the world? We thought it might have been a bad decision for Iraq and perhaps for surrounding countries, but it's had a major impact on world politics.
Exactly. And one word about France. You know, you have 6 million Muslims. Half of them registered as French citizens. The other ones, come from North Africa many years ago. And I must say that France is at the heart of the European continent. It's something. It is so, it is because of its history. And if something bad happened to France, it will spill over to other countries. Radicalism, a fight against Islam, a bad economy, something, France is France. You cannot roll out the history of France. Bad things can happen in Greece. But if France falls, I think the European countries will feel the symptoms of the French disease. So I'm afraid of that. On the Israeli thing, you asked Natasha, if France has a stand, Alan, I don't know if you're for or against, but since 1967, since Charles de Gaulle said, get out of the territories, France has not changed its policy. They are very friendly. French-Israeli relations have never been better than today. But still, the French position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has remained the same. Get out of the territories and you'll get recognition and maybe peace in the Middle East. On this, there's a difference between Israel and France.
But again, it's very important to understand the difference between being anti-Israel on the one hand and being against specific policies of particular Israeli governments on the other hand. And what we're seeing in Europe is that the leadership of Europe, whether it be France or England or Germany, generally is quite supportive of Israel, though opposed to the occupation and the settlements. But among the people, particularly young people, university people, increasing numbers of Muslims in these countries, the attitude is virulently anti-Israel, as distinguished from simply opposed to Israeli policies. So I see the danger of anti-Israel attitudes throughout Europe increasing as university students graduate, as unemployment increases, as more Muslims become active in the politics of Europe. So I see the trends going in the wrong direction, because in democracies, Ultimately, the leaders follow the people.
Alan, one thing, as an Israeli, as a former Knesset member, we Israelis, Jews in Israel, have to make a decision on the future of the settlements and the territory. It's our job to do this because, as you said, it's getting worse. And Muslims will get to the French parliament, they will get to the Dutch parliament, to the German, and in 20 years, it will be worse than now. So in a way, I expected my leaders to take a stand. You know, 5 days after the Six-Day War, Levi Eshkol asked the generals, okay, great achievement on the field, but what do we do with the territories? And Moshe Dayan said, we will keep them as a card, as a trading card. In case they want peace, we will make peace with them. But since then, we've been stuck in 1 or 2 months, 50 years. And we have to make a decision.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And although I voted against Donald Trump and for Hillary Clinton, I really do think that the Trump administration holds significant prospect of perhaps negotiating a deal. We hear from a great many sources that Abbas, toward the end of his life and career, is anxious to make peace. We've heard that before, but it has to be tested. He's coming to Washington. He's going to meet with the president. He's going to meet with some Jewish leaders. I do think that the time is now opportune for Israel to make a deal that protects its security and gets it out of the situation where it is becoming more and more of a pariah to young people around the world. Israel should never compromise its security in the interest of gaining support from around the world, but the settlements are not part of Israel's security. Indeed, I think they undercut Israel's security. So a realistic peace whereby Israel exchanges land for land and creates a dynamic where we can have a demilitarized Palestinian state. This is a perfect opportunity to do it. And as was proved previously by several writers, when the United States has Israel's back and when Israel feels strong and secure, it's more likely to offer compromises for peace. That happened under the Clinton administration. It happened under George W. Bush's administration. It did not happen under the Barack Obama administration because Israel didn't feel that Barack Obama had Israel's back. But hopefully it may happen again under the Trump administration.
Okay, just a second. Alan, it's a joy to listen to what you're saying now. I'm pleased personally because it's a great position coming from an American Jewish leader like you. It's very important that these things should be, heard by many people.
Absolutely. Now, I would like to switch our focus to what is happening here in Israel beyond just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. Ben Simon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's Israeli society. We understand that you've been identified with this struggle for those living in the periphery, but I'd like to dive further into Sephardic-Ashkenazi relations. There is a major focus on Israeli-Palestinian divides, as we said, and it doesn't often leave us with the time to focus on the internal divides that we see here. Now, what needs to change when it comes to improving relations between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities?
What's amazing, at the beginning of the state, we used to be one tribe. The effort to build a country and the outside threat made Jews live together like a family. We were like a family in the 50s and 60s. And Alan, you should know that we are becoming now so many tribes, and it's not getting better between the Russian Jews and the Moroccan Jews and the Yemenite and the Ashkenazi establishment. Most Israeli politics is based on this fragmentation. Those who came from Arab countries feel that they have been, outside of the system. They are not represented in the Israeli elites, and they're asking themselves 70 years after, third generation after we came to Israel, how come we are still sidelined in all the Israeli elites? And this demand is legitimate, but and it's the base of the frustration of so many Sephardic Jews who feel that nothing has changed since 1948. And
it's so interesting because in the United States, we had similar immigrations. We got close to 1 million Russians. We have hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews, most recently an enormous and wonderful influx of Persian Jews, largely in Los Angeles and in Great Neck in New York. And I just don't see any of that in the United States. Ashkenazi Jews really welcome with open arms immigrants from other countries. Unlike in the beginning when my family came over in 1890 and 1904, the German Jews who were here since 1850s were not receptive. They had the Galveston program trying to send many of them off to Texas. But today, I think we welcome with open arms Jews from anywhere in the world. And here's one area where I think Israel perhaps can learn from the United States.
Absolutely.
I would have thought that integration would be better in Israel because of the army, because you have substantial intermarriage between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic community. You'd think that, and Likud obviously relies heavily on voters from the Sephardic community, yet it's an elitist Ashkenazi party in some ways. You'd think that it would be better in Israel, and I'm very disappointed to hear that it really is very much a work in progress in Israel.
You're doing, I mean, America is the model. I mean, this diversified society, multicultural. I tell you about myself. I used to work in Davar. Have you heard about paper Davar?
Of course, of course.
Okay, I was the only, not only the Moroccan, only Sephardi Jew working in the paper. And then I was in Haaretz. I spent something like 15 years in Haaretz. I was the only Moroccan Jew. I mean, Moroccan Israeli. You cannot base a paper which can, you know, appeal to all Israelis if all the journalists are Ashkenazi.
Sure.
You cannot trust the Supreme Court. If of the 15 judges, you have only one Sephardi, that's Alan, you have to be represented in order to feel part of the system.
I agree completely. I agree completely. And I think that, you know, Israel brags on having affirmative action programs for Israeli Arabs, but it has to make sure that its own Jewish citizens of every background are adequately represented in all forms of Israeli life. So my question to you is, what can we as American Jews who care deeply about Israel, we generally tend to focus mostly on external problems that Israel faces, what can we do to be helpful in bringing the Sephardic community more into the mainstream of Israeli life? How can we be helpful?
Listen, you gave the answer in your question. When you come here and you meet Israeli leaders, you speak about security. I must say, Alan, you should know that Israel is one of the strongest countries in the world, one of the maybe third, fourth powerful country in the world. It's a small country, but a huge superpower. You have to talk more on Israeli society, on the problems within the society, not the external problems. Israel, in terms of security, has never been better today. I mean, since 1948. So I would say that you have to change the focus. Talk more about the marginal groups, about religion. How does it do? You know, are we doing better in terms of including people more, to be more, in terms of, you know, to be more moderate on religion, about Sephardi Jews who live outside of Tel Aviv. Are they doing better? What about the numbers in universities? Can we help in terms of affirmative action? So there's so many questions, mainly in the internal front, and you should talk about this when you meet Israeli leaders.
But it does pose a problem for an American like me. I feel comfortable talking about security, but I feel less comfortable because I'm not an Israeli telling Israel how to run its internal society. I feel comfortable talking about the religious issues because as a Jew, I want to make sure I have access, my wife, my daughter have access to the Kotel, that conservative Jews, which I count myself among. I actually attend an Orthodox synagogue, a conservative synagogue, and a Reform synagogue. But I want to see Israel more acceptant of conservative and Reform Jews. But when it comes to ethnic problems within Israel, we are Americans largely ignorant. We don't have as much of a stake. We're not citizens. We have not made Aliyah. And we have to be a little bit differential in how we deal with Israel's local issues. But I take your point, and I think it's a very important one.
Alan, instead of taking left and right Israelis, we are sick of this division, left and right, because eventually we go for the same solution of the problem. There's not much difference. You have to invite to Jewish communities, people who talk about Israeli society, who come from a different background. Maybe their English is not so good. But the question of left and right is caduc, is passé, yes, in French, I would say, and maybe talk about the Israeli society, take people from Beersheba, take people from development towns, take some young Israeli Arabs who work at the hospital as doctors. We are changing constantly, and the discourse has also, we all depend on you, because you have established a great country, and you have this kind of diversity, this tolerance, which we don't have yet. And maybe you should find the right people, in the right communities, students, or anything you want, and to listen to a different tone, to a different speech, not security, not army, not the Air Force, but rather on the Israeli society. How are we doing exactly as a society?
Mr. Ben-Simon, thank you so much for coming in. Unfortunately, we have to move on to our next guest, but we would love to talk about this for much longer. True, Professor Dershowitz?
Thank you. Sure. That was great conversation. Thank you.
With Israeli Independence Day on the horizon, we want to do what's customary, so it's a special treat for our audience. Joining us in this studio is American comedian Benji Lovett, who for the last 9 years has been writing out an annual list of all the things that he loves about Israel. Take it away, Benji.
American-Israeli comedian. 10 years in Israel.
American-Israeli, that's true.
Yeah. Alan, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I love stand-up comedy. I love sit-down comedy, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
I hear you're a very funny guy yourself.
Well, you know, some of my good friends are, Larry David is one of my good friends. I learn from the best.
But tell Larry I'm sorry I didn't return his phone calls. I feel terrible about that.
I'll call him. Right.
So, Yom Ha'atzmaut is coming up. There's so many things we love about this magical country. I wanted to share a few observations with you and see what you thought about these. These are only in Israel moments. So, Alan, I love that in America, Esty Ginsburg would be an 80-year-old grandmother in Boca. In Israel, she's a swimsuit model who also lights the Hanukkah candles, by the way. Just amazing.
Love it.
We'll do another one and see what you think. I love that in Israel, you can talk to a total stranger for 5 minutes, ask if his sister is single, and not get punched in the face. Yeah, you might have heard that Israelis are a little bit more straightforward than Jews in America.
Very good. Very good. I like that.
Yeah, let me ask you this. We're very straightforward here. Do you know how to say in Hebrew political correctness?
There's probably not a word for it,
Very
right?
good. Alan, you are a funny guy. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
All right, a couple more. I love that when you call the wrong number on a holiday, they say Chag Sameach before hanging up.
That's good.
It's amazing.
That's good.
All right. I love that certain stores advertise their dependability by claiming to be open 24/6.
Well, there's a cartoon in the New Yorker about a chassid on the phone calling his business partner and saying, you know, you can always call me 24/6.
It's amazing. This is the only place I've seen it. Now, let me ask you this. Speaking of religion, and you know, a lot of people love Jerusalem for the spirituality and the religion. A lot of people love Tel Aviv for the beach and energy. What about you? Are you more a Jerusalem guy or a Tel Aviv guy?
I always divide my time. I go to Jerusalem first. I make my pilgrimage to the Kotel. I meet my religious family members, and then I go to Tel Aviv where I have a great meal, go to a restaurant, a Georgian restaurant where they drink vodka and dance on the tables.
Yeah.
So I like both.
Is that Nanuchka? Is that the restaurant you're talking about?
That's the one.
That's a good one.
Do you know that President Obama once called me while I was in Nanuchka, and I had to say, I'm sorry, I can't take your call. I can't hear anything. Call me in 15 minutes when I'm back in the hotel. And the White House switchboard said, we're not used to people saying we can't take a call from the president, but Nanuchka prevailed.
See, I like that Israeli straightforwardness.
Israelis have even more chutzpah than Americans. I don't know why they're critical of the term. It's a wonderful term. It suggests an unwillingness to bow one's head. It literally comes from the Bible. When Abraham argued with God, Hashofet kol aretz lo yaseh mishpat chalila lecha, the Talmud describes that as chutzpah kla'apei shemaya, using the Aramaic. So there's a very early historical religious source for the term chutzpah. I'm proud to be called a chutzpahnik.
You know, see, if I had had you as my Hebrew school teacher, things would have turned out differently. We didn't learn so much when I was a student.
Education is much, much better today than it was in my day, or I suspect in your day.
Now, Alan, we got to wrap up. Last thing, speaking of chutzpah, how about next time you come to Israel, we do stand-up comedy together? What do you think, you and me?
Well, I'm getting old now, so you do the stand-up, I'll do the sit-down.
Great.
And we'll do a joint appearance with you standing over me and me trying to respond to your very, very fun comments.
Alan, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All
My
right.
pleasure.
Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz, and I also want to thank all of our guests. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.